Welcome back to Scottish Sleep Stories. In tonight's episode, we journey into the quiet before the storm, into the silence that fell over Westeros just before everything changed, before the war, before the fall of a dynasty, before the Iron Throne passed from dragon to stag. Tonight, we'll explore the true story of Robert's rebellion, the madness of a king, the prophecy-haunted prince, the crown of winter roses that sparked a kingdom's ruin, and the choices that reshaped history forever. But here is the question I want you to consider as we begin. Do you believe this war was born from love or from destiny? Was it rebellion against tyranny or the unfolding of something long foretold? If you enjoy deep, immersive storytelling that brings history and legend to life, don't forget to subscribe to Scottish Sleep Stories. And as you listen, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe truly caused the fall of the Targaryens? Now, there exists a certain hush, a pregnant stillness that descends upon a kingdom in the moments preceding monumental change. It is not the comforting silence of peace, the crackling tranquility of a hearth fire on a winter's eve, or the gentle hush of falling snow blanketing the landscape. This silence is distinct, imbued with a palpable tension. It is the collective held breath of a realm, a silent anticipation as it senses without yet fully comprehending that the very foundations of the world it has always known are about to shatter. Westeros was no stranger to this foreboding silence in the years leading up to Robert's rebellion. Lords continued to host lavish feasts in their grand halls, the sounds of merriment echoing through the night. Ravens diligently carried missives between towering castles, their wings cutting through the air. Knights clad in gleaming armor rode out on hunts, their hounds baying in pursuit of game. And the small folk, the backbone of the realm, toiled in their fields, coaxing sustenance from the earth. Superficially, life in Westeros continued as it always had, a familiar tapestry woven with threads of tradition and routine. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the proud banners and the centuries-old oaths sworn to the Targaryen dynasty, a subtle unraveling had begun. The reign of Aerys II, the Mad King, had been rotting from within for years, slowly and insidiously, like damp creeping through the stonework of a mighty fortress, weakening its structure until the very walls threatened to crumble. Those closest to the king, the members of his court, his advisors, his own family, were the first to witness this decay. The man who sat upon the Iron Throne, the symbol of Targaryen power, was no longer the promising ruler he had once been. A shadow had fallen upon him, twisting his mind and poisoning his judgment. What followed, the rebellion that ultimately brought an end to nearly 3 centuries of Targaryen rule, did not erupt from the clash of armies on the battlefield. It began with a seemingly innocent gesture, the placement of winter roses in a young girl's lap. A brother's simmering rage, a father's agonizing death, and a king's unchecked madness unleashed a chain of events that would engulf the realm in fire and blood. It ended in rivers of blood staining the soil of Westeros crimson. This is the story of Robert's rebellion, a tale of love and loss, of betrayal and sacrifice, of madness and courage. Gather close to the fire, let its warmth seep into your bones, for the tale I am about to unfold is far from warm. It is a chilling reminder of the fragility of power and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. Aerys Targaryen, in his youth, was not the tyrannical figure that history remembers with such disdain. There was a time, a brief but shining moment, that those who lived through it still recall with a mixture of mournful wonder and disbelief, when he was considered one of the most promising kings the Targaryen dynasty had produced in generations. Ambitious and possessed of a quick and restless intelligence, he ascended to the Iron Throne with the unwavering confidence of a man who truly believed himself capable of achieving greatness. And for a time, the realm, weary of the stagnation of previous reigns, dared to believe in him too. Those early years, Aerys spoke of grand plans for the future of Westeros, new roads to connect the disparate regions, bustling harbors to facilitate trade, and a renewed effort to establish lucrative trade routes with the distant shores of the East. He made a point of visiting his lords in their ancestral seats, traveling throughout the realm with an infectious energy that suggested a man determined to leave an indelible mark on the history of Westeros. The small folk, fortunate enough to glimpse their young king as he processed through their humble villages, saw a figure of hope. A young king in gleaming armor, his eyes bright with vision, his silver Targaryen hair catching the sunlight like spun moonlight. They whispered amongst themselves, daring to hope that perhaps this generation would be different, that the troubled reigns of the past would finally give way to an era of peace and prosperity. And beside him in those hopeful early years stood a hand who balanced him perfectly, a man whose strengths complemented Aerys's weaknesses, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, a man of cold, precise competence whose mind functioned with the ruthless efficiency of a ledger, every debt meticulously recorded, every asset carefully measured, every liability ruthlessly calculated and contained. Where Aerys was mercurial, prone to sudden bursts of enthusiasm and impulsive decisions, Tywin was steady, a rock of pragmatism in a turbulent sea. Where the king leaned toward the dramatic and the impulsive, his hand leaned toward the methodical and the calculated. Together, for a time, they seemed like the kind of partnership that could sustain a long and prosperous peace, a harmonious blend of vision and practicality. Tywin efficiently managed the daily affairs of the realm, meticulously overseeing the grain tallies, the tax rolls, and the long-standing disputes between lesser lords, ensuring that the crown ran smoothly enough that few lords found reason to voice their complaints too loudly. The credit for that smoothness, at least publicly, was given to the King Aerys. But the lords who dealt directly with the crown, who witnessed Tywin's unwavering competence firsthand, knew where the true power resided, where the real decisions were being made, and that knowledge, that subtle shift in perception, was the seed of everything that would eventually go wrong between them. Relationships between kings and their advisors, particularly their hands, are fragile things, delicate ecosystems that require constant tending. They depend on mutual trust, on egos kept firmly in check, on the king being willing to be served by someone more capable than himself without succumbing to resentment and envy. And Aerys, as the years passed and his mind grew increasingly suspicious, more volatile, more easily stoked to fury, found himself increasingly unable to maintain that equanimity. He began to see in Tywin not a loyal servant of the crown, but a potential rival to it, a shadow looming over his throne. He began to feel fueled by whispers and paranoia that the realm loved his hand more than it loved its king. Lords praised Tywin's efficient administration. Merchants valued the unwavering reliability of House Lannister. There were whispers, carefully not made directly to Aerys's ear lest the speaker face the king's wrath, that the real power at court wore a golden lion, the sigil of House Lannister, and not a three-headed dragon, the sigil of House Targaryen. Aerys, who had always imagined himself at the very center of the historical tapestry, found himself slowly receding toward the margins of his own reign, his influence diminishing with each passing year. The paranoia grew from that seed, quietly at first, manifesting in small ways that those closest to him initially noted and excused, telling themselves that these were temporary aberrations, that they would pass with time. A king's temper, after all, was not unusual. Every reign had its storms, its moments of turbulence. The men and women around Aerys had enough experience with the intricacies of courtly life to know that proximity to power required patience and understanding. But the paranoia did not pass. It festered, growing stronger with each perceived slight, each imagined insult. It is the particular cruelty of minds that turn inward in such a destructive manner that they do not crumble all at once, collapsing in a single dramatic event. Instead, they decay slowly and agonizingly like a rotting corpse. They find suspicion where there is none, seeking evidence of conspiracy in ordinary gestures, interpreting treachery in expressions of loyalty, and perceiving mockery in acts of deference. Chris began to see plots everywhere lurking in the faces of his counselors, hidden within the contents of letters that passed through the castle, even in the very question of succession itself. He grew possessive of his power in the way a desperate man clutches something he fears will be stolen, until the very act of clutching becomes the cause of the object's damage. His relationship with Tywin curdled over years of accumulated insults, some imagined, born from his paranoia, others inflicted deliberately, fueled by his growing resentment. When Tywin's son Jaime, a young man of extraordinary promise, was chosen for the King's Guard, the elite order of knights sworn to protect the monarch, it was widely understood as Aerys's calculated gesture of contempt, a deliberate attempt to wound Tywin. A man of the King's Guard could not marry, could not inherit, and could not become Lord of Casterly Rock. By taking Jaime into his White Cloak service, Aerys had effectively stripped Tywin of his heir and his legacy, ensuring that the Lannister line would end with Tywin himself. The king had found a cruelty that required no blade, a weapon more subtle and devastating than any sword. In response, Tywin resigned his position as Hand of the King, throwing the realm into further disarray. He returned to Casterly Rock, his ancestral seat in the Westerlands, his pride wounded, his ambition thwarted. He did not make a public grievance of it, but he also did not forget the insult. The slight festered within him, fueling his resentment and shaping his future actions. And in the years that followed, as the court filled with lesser men, sycophants, and flatterers who knew how to tell a king what he wished to hear rather than what he needed to know, the rot within Aerys festered unchecked, finding less and less resistance. The voices of reason and restraint were silenced, replaced by the echoes of madness. There were moments, pivotal events that sharpened the decay into something far more dangerous, moments that marked the point of no return in Aerys's unraveling. The Defiance of Duskendale is one such event, a turning point that historians return to again and again because it so clearly demonstrates the depths of Aerys's descent into madness. Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale, a port city in the Crownlands, had grown resentful of the king's policies, feeling that his city was being unfairly burdened by royal taxation and regulations. In a decision that still baffles those who attempt to understand it, a catastrophic miscalculation born of pride and desperation, he chose to hold the king himself hostage. His reasoning, as muddled as it was, centered on issues of city charters and trading rights, a localized dispute blown out of all proportion. Aerys, with his small traveling retinue, rode to Duskendale personally, intending to address the grievance and assert his royal authority. Instead, he found himself seized, betrayed by a lord he had trusted, and thrown into the dungeons of the Dunfort, Duskendale's imposing castle. He was held there for nearly half a year, a prisoner in his own kingdom. At court in King's Landing, men moved cautiously in that time, each step carefully considered, each word carefully chosen. No one wanted to commit an army to retake Duskendale, fearing that any direct action might result in the king's death before he could be rescued. The situation was a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. It fell to Sir Barristan Selmy, a knight already renowned for his unmatched skill with a sword and his unwavering courage, to resolve the crisis. He was already developing the reputation that would eventually make him one of the most celebrated knights of his generation, a true embodiment of chivalry. Under the cover of darkness, Barristan Selmy slipped into the city with a small company of hand-picked soldiers, navigating the treacherous streets and evading the watchful eyes of the Duskendale guards. He infiltrated the Dunfort, fought his way through the labyrinthine corridors, and finally reached the dungeon where the king was being held. He freed Aerys from his captivity, and together they fought their way back to safety, escaping Duskendale and returning to King's Landing. Lord Darklyn's audacious plan ended with his house extinguished, wiped from the face of Westeros. Every member of the Darklyn line, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, was put to the sword. The neighboring house that had foolishly supported him in his act of rebellion met the same grim fate. Aerys made certain that the lesson was absolute, a brutal display of royal power designed to deter any future acts of defiance. But when Aerys emerged from those dungeons, the man who came out was not the man who had entered. The captivity had broken something within him, leaving him scarred and twisted. The particular quality of what broke is difficult to define, but it was a fundamental shift in his perception of the world and his place in it. The indignity of being held captive, the helplessness of his situation, the image of himself, a Targaryen, blood of the dragon, sitting in the dark at the mercy of a minor lord, all of it combined to shatter his sense of self. A king should command respect, inspire fear. A Targaryen should be inviolate, a symbol of power and authority. He should never suffer fear. That knowledge, that stark realization of his own vulnerability, sat inside him afterward like a festering wound that would not close cleanly, poisoning his mind and driving him further into madness. Men who are held captive and then released sometimes find their way back to themselves, gradually piecing together the shattered fragments of their former lives. They reach for the familiar rhythms of their previous existence, and gradually the trauma recedes enough to be managed, to be integrated into their understanding of the world. Aerys, however, did not find his way back. He reached instead for the thing that had always felt most like power, the thing he associated most deeply with the ancient legacy of his house, fire. His obsession with wildfire, that volatile and destructive substance, deepened in the years that followed the Defiance of Duskendale, consuming his thoughts and shaping his actions. The pyromancers, the members of the Alchemist's Guild, the keepers of that terrible green substance that burned hotter than ordinary flame and could not be extinguished by water, found themselves elevated to a prominence they had not previously enjoyed at court. They were consulted on matters of state, their opinions valued above those of seasoned advisors. They were indulged in their esoteric experiments, granted access to vast resources. Their methods were questioned in obsessive detail, the intricacies of their craft dissected and analyzed. Aerys filled their ears with grand visions of fiery destruction, of cleansing flames that would purify the realm. He filled the city's hidden places with their clay pots of liquid fire, a silent army waiting to be unleashed. He saw in wildfire the power to restore the Targaryen dynasty to its former glory, the power to silence his enemies and crush any dissent. He saw in it the resonance of old stories, of dragons soaring through the sky, of conquest and dominion, of the bloodright of his house. He knew at some level that he would never have a dragon of his own. The last of the great beasts had died generations before his birth, their roars silenced, their scales turned to dust, and the magic that had called them into being, the ancient blood rituals and arcane incantations, could not simply be commanded back, but fire, even the fire of men, even the constructed and bottled approximation that the pyromancers brewed in their vaulted chambers, felt like the closest thing available, a pale imitation of the power that had once flowed through the veins of his ancestors. And fire, unlike his rebellious lords and his scheming advisors, was something he could control. Unlike his son Rhaegar, who inspired devotion and loyalty in those around him, Aerys could not command genuine affection. Unlike his former hand Tywin, who had outshone him in matters of governance, Aerys could not inspire competence. But fire, the destructive force that consumed all in its path, did what it was told. It obeyed his commands, bending to his will, his cruelty sharpened alongside his obsession, becoming a defining characteristic of his reign. Men who crossed him in council, who dared to voice dissenting opinions, might find themselves languishing in a cell, stripped of their titles and possessions. Men in cells, those who had fallen out of favor or incurred the king's wrath, might find themselves dragged into the courtyard, bound to a post, with the pyromancers standing ready, their faces masked, their hands clutching the tools of their terrifying trade. Those who witnessed such scenes reported a particular brightness in the king's eye during these moments, a relaxing of the jaw that almost passed for relief, as if the act of inflicting pain somehow eased the torment within him. Those around him adapted, as people always adapt to the unpredictable weather of a powerful man's moods. They learned what not to say, what topics to avoid, what expressions to suppress. They learned to agree, to smooth over disagreements, and to redirect the conversation away from dangerous subjects, because the alternative was to become the example, to suffer the king's wrath firsthand. The small council, the men who were supposed to advise and moderate and serve as the thoughtful mechanism of governance, became instead a collection of survivors, each calculating daily how to remain standing while the ground shifted beneath their feet. The trust and candor that had once characterized their deliberations were replaced by fear and suspicion. Aerys distrusted Rhaegar, his own son and heir, the prince who had grown up reading in libraries and playing his silver harp, and who inspired the kind of easy affection in lords and small folk that Aerys had spent years chasing without finding. Aerys saw in Rhaegar's popularity not a valuable resource for the crown, but a direct threat to his throne, a potential rival waiting to usurp his power. He could not be certain, for paranoia never provided certainty, only the persistent low hum of suspicion, but he wondered whether his son was simply admired for his grace and intelligence, or whether he was actively preparing to supplant him. And so, by the time the great tournament at Harrenhal was announced, the stage was already set for disaster. The king's court was a place of fear, a stage where elaborate ceremonies masked the underlying currents of paranoia and resentment. His counsel served him not out of loyalty or respect, but out of a desperate desire for survival. The small mercies, the acts of compassion and restraint that had once prevented the worst excesses of his madness, had been worn away one by one, like stone under the relentless pressure of slow-moving water. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the condition of Westeros in the years leading up to Robert's rebellion is not that Aerys was hated, though by then he was broadly feared rather than loved, and fear can maintain a certain kind of order. More dangerous was the fact that the old checks on a king's worst impulses, the safeguards that had traditionally prevented a monarch from descending into tyranny, had been almost entirely dismantled. The trusted hand, the honest counsel, the family member who could speak plainly and offer dissenting advice, all of it had been stripped away or cowed into silence. There was no one left who could pull on his sleeve and say, "Enough. There is no good end down this path." When a wheel begins to turn in such conditions, without brakes or restraints, there is nothing to slow its momentum. Westeros was not yet at war, but it was poised on the brink, ready to erupt into chaos at the slightest spark. Was the purse from the it was a pat the small they cheered. There was a weather that by Harrenhal it was the first Rhaegar he was Rhaegar he moved and then he rode the crown of flowers. The traditional symbol of victory and honor at the end of a great tournament was traditionally placed upon her brow, acknowledging her role as the queen of love and beauty. That was the custom, the expectation, the ritual that years of such events had trained the watching lords and ladies to anticipate. Instead, Rhaegar continued riding, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the princess. He stopped before Lyanna Stark. She was the daughter of Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, a young woman still in her mid-teens, dark-haired and gray-eyed in the manner of the old northern blood, with a reputation carefully noted by her father and brother for being fiercer and more independent than her station required. She was also betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, in an arrangement that had been carefully negotiated to bind the two houses together, forging a strong alliance between the Stormlands and the North. And Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, heir to the Iron Throne, placed the crown of winter roses not on his wife, but in Lyanna Stark's lap, naming her the Queen of Love and Beauty, publicly rejecting his wife and bestowing the honor upon another man's betrothed. The silence that followed lasted a breath too long, an eternity in the tense atmosphere of the tournament. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken words, with shocked disbelief, with simmering resentment, with the weight of centuries of tradition being carelessly cast aside. There are accounts from men who were present that describe the crowd's reaction differently, depending on where they stood and who they were loyal to. Those who loved pageantry and spectacle saw a moment of breathtaking drama, a romantic gesture that transcended the mundane realities of politics. Those who loved Elia or felt loyalty to the Dornish princess experienced the moment as a deeply personal and public humiliation, the kind that leaves lasting marks on a person's dignity that do not heal cleanly. Those who had spent years reading the signs of the realm's instability, who had watched Aerys burn, who had watched Rhaegar disappear into his studies and his silences, who had counted the small decisions that had accumulated into a growing sense of danger, felt a chill move through the air, a premonition of the chaos to come. Robert Baratheon was present, his face darkening with fury. He watched Rhaegar crown another man's betrothed, his own betrothed, and he said nothing in the moment, knowing that a violent response in such a setting was impossible, that it would only bring dishonor upon himself and his house. But his feelings about the gesture were never truly hidden. He was not a man of subtle reaction, prone to explosive outbursts and passionate displays of emotion. Whatever form his response took in the weeks and months that followed, the drinking, the arguments, the particular loudness of his company at feasts, it drew from a wellspring of anger and resentment that had been filled to overflowing at Harrenhal. Now, Rhaegar's intentions at that tournament have been debated and analyzed ever since, dissected by historians and gossiped about by courtiers. The simplest reading is that it was the vanity of a prince who had fallen into feeling for a girl he had seen and who acted on that feeling without regard for the consequences, a reckless act of passion that ignited a kingdom. But those who knew Rhaegar's character, those who had observed him closely over the years, pushed back on the simplicity of that reading. He was not a man who acted on impulse, not a frivolous prince driven by fleeting desires. He was a man who acted on conviction, on deeply held beliefs, and who believed that his convictions had roots in something older and larger than the immediate moment, something that transcended personal desires and ambitions. Whatever prophecy or pattern he saw in Lyanna Stark, whatever role he had assigned her in the great story he believed himself to be living, It was not by the evidence of his behavior before and after, an ordinary desire, a simple infatuation. That does not make what followed right, nor does it excuse the pain and suffering he caused. It may, however, make it stranger, more complex, more difficult to understand. In the months after Harrenhal, Rhaegar was absent from court more frequently and with less explanation, his actions shrouded in secrecy. He was consulting with scholars, delving deeper into ancient texts. He was riding south, disappearing for weeks at a time. He was, by the fragmentary accounts of those who glimpsed him in that period, a man pursuing something with great urgency and great certainty, a man driven by a purpose that consumed him entirely. People who have that quality about them, that unwavering conviction, are not easily stopped by the ordinary considerations of other people's peace, their lives bent to the service of a higher calling. And then, one fateful day, Lyanna Stark disappeared, vanishing from Winterfell without a trace. The exact circumstances of that disappearance remain one of the great uncertainties of recent history, shrouded in rumor and speculation. There are those who say the prince rode north with armed companions, members of his household guard, and took her by force, a kidnapping as it was immediately understood throughout the realm, a blatant act of aggression that violated the laws of hospitality and dishonored House Stark. There are others, fewer in number, speaking more quietly, citing details that only emerged much later, who suggest that the reality was more complicated, that there were letters sent beforehand, secret communications between Rhaegar and Lyanna, that there were choices made that complicated the simple story of abduction, that Lyanna herself, fierce and unconventional, may have been less passive in the sequence of events than her age and her gender made it convenient to assume. But the truth of Lyanna's intentions, whatever they may have been, was not what moved the realm to war. What moved the realm was the assumption, the immediate and reasonable conclusion drawn by the vast majority of people, given what had been seen at Harrenhal, consistent with everything a highborn girl's disappearance with a prince's household guard suggested, abduction, the dishonoring of a Stark daughter by a Targaryen prince who had already insulted her betrothed before thousands of witnesses. For Robert Baratheon, Lyanna's disappearance was everything he had feared since Harrenhal made manifest, the culmination of his worst nightmares. Lord Rickard Stark, it was a crisis that required a careful, measured response, the kind a senior lord with experience in these matters would be expected to provide: deliberation, counsel, a raven sent to allies, a plan assembled before any rash action was taken. But the first Stark to act was not Rickard, the wise and cautious lord of Winterfell. It was his headstrong and impulsive son, Brandon. Before the war, before the crown of roses, before Lyanna's name became a word spoken in the same breath as ruin, there was a boy reading in a library, a prince who had turned somewhere in his youth from the ordinary training of lordship toward the study of older things, a scholar delving into the mysteries of the past. He had, by the accounts of the maesters who served Dragonstone, spent long stretches of his boyhood in the castle's vast and dusty library, poring over ancient tomes and forgotten scrolls. He read histories and prophecies and the records of ancient Targaryen dreams, searching for answers to questions that few others even dared to ask. And at some point in that reading, the exact age varies depending on the telling, he found something that changed the direction of everything, something that set him on a path that would lead him to both glory and ruin. He set down his books, closed the leather-bound volumes, and asked for a sword, abandoning the world of scholarship for the life of a warrior. The men around him at the time took it as a natural transition, a prince growing into his martial responsibilities, preparing himself to rule. But those who paid closer attention to what Rhaegar said in those years, those who listened carefully to his cryptic pronouncements and his veiled allusions, believed that the change was not about ambition or custom. It was about duty, a sense of obligation to something larger than himself. He had read enough to conclude that a warrior would be needed for what was coming, for the great darkness that he believed was looming on the horizon, and that the warrior would have to be him. The tradition he was reading in was old, ancient prophecies about a promised prince, a hero reborn from the line of the dragon, destined to stand against a great darkness, the legend of Azor Ahai, the Song of Ice and Fire, as some texts named it. These were not idle stories to Rhaegar, not mere myths and legends. They were, as he came to understand them, a map, a guide to the future, a map of what the world required, the role he was destined to play, and who was meant to provide it. He believed for much of his youth that the prince in the prophecy was himself, that he was the chosen one destined to save the world. This conviction was not madness, not in the same way that his father's obsessions were madness. Aerys's madness was born of fear and paranoia, of cruelty and a desperate need for control. Rhaegar's conviction was different, ordered, studied, the product of years of careful reading and sincere belief, not of malice or delusion. He was a man who had constructed, through genuine intellectual effort, a framework for understanding his own life and his place in the age he lived in, a grand narrative that gave meaning to his existence. The difficulty is that conviction, however carefully built, does not make a man right, makes him certain, unwavering in his beliefs, impervious to doubt, and certainty, particularly the kind that concerns one's own destiny, has a way of bending other people's lives around itself without asking their permission, twisting their fates to fit the contours of a preordained narrative. People who interacted with Rhaegar often noted a peculiar duality in his character, a blend of genuine warmth and an underlying detachment. He possessed a captivating presence, demonstrating a sincere curiosity towards those he engaged with, lavishing them with his undivided attention. Yet lurking behind his captivating eyes was the unmistakable impression of a man preoccupied, his thoughts consumed by matters that demanded his presence at a specific location and time, for reasons he could not fully articulate to those around him. It was as if a vital part of him remained elsewhere, tethered to some distant imperative. As the years unfolded and the weight of prophecy gradually dominated his thoughts, Rhaegar became increasingly fixated on deciphering the markers described within the ancient texts. "The dragon must have 3 heads," he would murmur, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The hero will be born of a specific lineage, under specific signs." His relentless pursuit led him to delve into the intricate web of bloodlines, meticulously scrutinizing his own children, Rhaenys and young Aegon, born to Elia Martell. Through a process of interpretation that remained shrouded in the mists of incomplete records, he came to believe in the imperative need for a 3rd child. Leah's health had suffered considerably during her previous pregnancies, and the royal maesters had cautioned against the grave risks associated with another birth. Rhaegar was fully aware of these dangers, yet he weighed this knowledge against the perceived demands of the prophecy, a prophecy that had become the cornerstone of his understanding of the world and his place within it. Was a terrible choice, one that history would grapple with for generations to come. The question of whether that fateful decision was cemented at Harrenhal during that legendary tourney continues to fuel endless debate. Was the crown of winter roses presented to Lyanna Stark merely an expression of personal affection, or did it signify a deeper prophetic intent? It is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively resolve, leaving room for endless speculation and interpretation. Those who held Rhaegar in high esteem championed the nobler interpretation, emphasizing the sincerity of his beliefs and the weight of the perceived burden he carried. However, those who bear witness to the devastating consequences of his actions argue that the nobility of motive does not lessen the impact of the ensuing events. A kingdom, after all, cares little for the intentions behind an action when that action plunges it into the chaos of war. Rhaegar's elopement with Lyanna Stark, whatever the circumstances surrounding it, was an act fueled by a certainty about the future, a certainty forged over years of solitary study and fervent conviction. He was not inherently cruel, nor was he careless in the conventional sense. Rather, he was a man who had reached a quiet, deliberate conclusion over the course of his life, that he understood the profound demands that destiny placed upon him. Perhaps he was right about the impending darkness, about the chilling threat that lurked beyond the wall, an ancient evil dismissed by the rest of the realm as mere children's tales. Time would ultimately render its verdict on that question. However, even being correct about the looming danger did not justify the methods employed in preparing for it. The realm does not readily forgive the torching of its houses, regardless of whether the torchbearer genuinely believed he was constructing a beacon of hope. Brandon Stark was a mere 20 years of age, the heir to Winterfell and all that the North represented. By all accounts, he embodied the ideals expected of a lord-in-waiting. He was imposing in stature, courageous, quick to anger, and even quicker to action. He possessed his father's regal bearing and echoed the ancient kings of winter in the way he carried himself. He was, crucially for the events that followed, a young man of intense emotion, fiercely devoted to his sister, and utterly lacking in patience when he perceived that her love had been dishonored. When news reached him that Lyanna had vanished, spirited away to the south by Rhaegar Targaryen, Brandon did not hesitate. He bypassed the customary protocols. He did not ride north to consult with his father, Lord Rickard. He did not dispatch a raven to Jon Arryn for counsel, nor did he seek the advice of his betrothed's father, Lord Hoster Tully. Fueled by a burning sense of outrage, he gathered a small group of companions and rode directly for King's Landing, his heart a tempest of fury. He arrived at the formidable gates of the Red Keep and issued a defiant challenge, his voice ringing with youthful anger. He demanded that Prince Rhaegar emerge and answer for his transgression. "Come out and die," were the unforgettable words that witnesses recalled. In a different court, under the reign of a more temperate king, Brandon's impassioned outburst might have been handled with greater finesse. A more level-headed ruler might have received him with patience, listened to his grievances, and offered some form of resolution that preserved appearances while allowing time for the truth, whatever it may be, to surface. Indeed, there were men within the court who possessed the diplomatic skill to navigate such a delicate situation. However, the man who received the news of Brandon's reckless challenge was Aerys Targaryen, the Mad King. Aerys did not see a distraught brother seeking justice. Instead, he perceived treason. He saw a northern lord audaciously challenging the blood of the crown within the very heart of royal power. Brandon's defiant act, Aerys saw the manifestation of all the conspiracies that had haunted his increasingly paranoid mind for years. He immediately ordered Brandon and his companions to be seized and brought before him in chains. This was the first catastrophe, the spark that would ignite a realm. The second came soon after, when Lord Rickard Stark received word of his son's imprisonment. He had no alternative but to travel to King's Landing, to appear before the king himself, and to seek, through the established channels of law and custom, the release of his heir. Lords summoned to court had the inherent right to travel safely under the king's protection. These were not merely traditions. They formed the bedrock of the compact that held the realm together. Rickard journeyed south in good faith, trusting in the age-old rules that govern such matters. But Aerys had already predetermined Rickard's fate. The trial that followed was a grotesque mockery of justice. Aerys declared that the Starks would face trial by combat, a tradition steeped in history. Typically, a champion would be selected, blades would be drawn, and the gods were expected to reveal their judgment through the outcome of the duel. However, Aerys named fire as his champion, not a knight, not a sword, but the element itself. What transpired within the throne room that day was not justice, nor even pure, unadulterated madness. It was the act of a king who had abandoned all pretense. Lord Rickard Stark, Warden of the North, lord of an ancient house that had ruled the North for 8,000 years, was suspended from the rafters in his full armor while a fire was lit beneath him. He was burned alive, a horrific spectacle of royal cruelty. Brandon was forced to bear witness to his father's agonizing demise. A noose had been fastened around his neck, and a sword was placed just beyond his desperate reach. With each futile attempt to grasp the blade, the noose tightened relentlessly. Brandon died strangled, agonizingly close to a means of escape that was forever out of reach. Cruel kings had occupied the Iron Throne before. Maegor the Cruel had committed unspeakable atrocities. Others had succumbed to moments of terrible excess. But these cruelties were often directed at those who had genuinely transgressed some established boundary or at enemies already stripped of the law's protection. What Aerys did to the Starks, however, shattered a fundamental principle. Lords who arrived at court under the king's protection in response to a lawful summons were supposed to be safe from harm. This was not merely a long-standing tradition, it was the very foundation of every feudal relationship within the realm. If a king could summarily execute great lords who came to court in good faith, then no lord was safe. The entire intricate arrangement of loyalty and service became utterly meaningless. The message reverberating throughout the realm was far different from what Aerys intended to convey. He believed he was demonstrating his absolute power, but in reality he was demonstrating that his power had turned against the very structures that legitimized it. Aerys then dispatched demands to Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie. He demanded the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, Ned, the last surviving Stark son, and Robert, whose betrothed had been stolen. Jon Arryn had raised both boys as his wards, nurturing them as if they were his own sons. Now the king he faithfully served was demanding their murders. Jon Arryn was well into his 60s, having served the Iron Throne with unwavering loyalty throughout his long life, observing the Targaryen dynasty with the patient dedication of a man who believed in the continuity of things. However, there are limits to what loyalty can demand, and the demand to kill two young men he had raised and loved, merely to appease the paranoia of a king who had just burned a great lord alive, far exceeded those limits. And so Jon Arryn called his banners and went to war. The rebellion that followed was not a clean, unified movement. Such things rarely are. Jon Arryn's decision did not trigger an immediate, coordinated uprising. Rather, it unleashed a series of individual decisions made by lords who had been waiting, some consciously, others subconsciously, for the signal to act. The executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark had not merely outraged the North. They had confirmed for every lord in the realm who had observed Aerys's descent with growing unease that the situation had deteriorated beyond the point of redemption. There exists a pivotal moment in the decline of any great order when its adherents transition from hoping for improvement to preparing for the inevitable aftermath. Aerys had provided that moment. The men who stepped forward to oppose him were not revolutionaries, at least not in their own eyes. Most of them, Robert's grief and fury were inextricably intertwined, transforming him into an elemental force in the coming conflict. Men followed Eddard's. The North did not enter wars lightly, but when it did, it fought with the unwavering seriousness of a people who understood that the vast distances and harsh winters of their homeland rendered every campaign a high-stakes gamble. They could not afford to squander their numbers. They fought carefully and completely. Hoster Tully of Riverrun threw his lot in with the rebels as well, securing the allegiance of the Riverlands and, crucially, control of the continent's strategically vital center. His decision was not solely driven by sympathy for the Stark cause. It was also a matter of astute political calculation. Hoster solidified the newly formed alliance through strategic marriages. Eddard Stark, who had been betrothed to a daughter of Riverrun in an arrangement disrupted by Brandon's death, now married Catelyn Tully. Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully. The rebellion was forged as much through blood bonds as through shared grievances. What the rebellion lacked, however, was Dorne. Prince Rhaegar's wife was Elia Martell. The Dornish had ample reason for grievance. The insult of Harrenhal, the humiliation of witnessing the Crown Prince publicly set aside his wife, was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet the Martells did not join the rebellion. They waited and watched, their motives unclear. Whether driven by shrewd calculation or genuine loyalty to Elia and her children's rightful place in the Targaryen line, Dorne remained neutral. This neutrality would not shield them from the war's consequences. However, it meant that the rebel alliance, despite its considerable strength, lacked the support of the entire realm. The Tyrells of the Reach remained steadfastly loyal to the crown. House Tyrell commanded vast resources and a formidable army, and their decision to support Aerys, or more accurately, their refusal to abandon him, prevented the rebel forces from sweeping through the south unopposed. The Siege of Storm's End, where Stannis Baratheon defended Robert's ancestral seat against a Tyrell army, would endure for the duration of the war without ever yielding. And then there was Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, the man who, for years, had served as the most capable hand the realm had ever seen. He declared for neither side. He amassed his armies at Casterly Rock and waited, observing. He communicated with both sides, offering no commitment to either. The realm understood in the unspoken language of lords that Tywin's support would ultimately go to whichever side appeared most likely to emerge victorious. He had not forgiven Aerys for the insults he had endured in recent years, the dismissals, the deliberate humiliations, the king's calculated efforts to diminish him. However, Tywin was not a man who acted on sentiment. He acted on cold, hard calculation. Until the outcome of the conflict became definitively clear, he kept his sword sheathed. This, then, was the strategic landscape as the war commenced. A rebel alliance comprised of the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands against the Crown, which held the Westerlands in a state of wary neutrality and commanded the armed forces of the Reach. The Crownlands, the territories immediately surrounding King's Landing, and the royal armies lay between them, the epicenter of the impending storm. The early battles favored the rebels. Robert Baratheon proved himself a natural commander, exhibiting immediate and decisive prowess on the battlefield. He was not a subtle tactician. He did not engage in complex maneuvers or deceptive strategies. He attacked, leading from the front with a ferocity that inspired his men and terrified his enemies. The warhammer he wielded, a weapon perfectly suited to a man of his build and temperament, a weapon too cumbersome for most knights to wield effectively, a weapon capable of crushing armor with a force that no blade could match, became a symbol of the rebellion before the war was even half over. There were setbacks, as there always are. The rebel forces were not always perfectly coordinated. Communication across the vast distances of Westeros was slow and unreliable. The Loyalist armies were not without skill or courage. The war's initial phase was a grueling, exhausting affair, less a clean clash of champions, as songs would later romanticize it, and more a difficult grinding effort to keep armies fed, allied lords appeased, and supply lines intact across hundreds of miles of contested territory. However, momentum was gradually shifting in favor of the rebels, building towards a single decisive moment. There exists a unique form of power held by the man who remains motionless, while the armies of the realm clashed in bloody conflict, while ravens crisscrossed the skies carrying messages of war and alliance, while the flames of rebellion spread across the Riverlands and the Stormlands. Tywin Lannister sat at Casterly Rock, his host assembled, his banners furled. He was, by most measures, the most powerful lord in Westeros. His wealth was legendary. His armies were among the largest and best equipped that a single house could field. His experience in governance, his deep understanding of what it actually took to hold a kingdom together, surpassed that of nearly every man alive. And yet he declared for neither side. To understand why he remained aloof and the true significance of his waiting, one must understand the complex character of Tywin Lannister and the history of his relationship with Aerys Targaryen. The two men had shaped each other in ways that did not flatter either of them. Tywin had served as Hand of the King for the better part of 2 decades. He had stabilized the realm during Aerys's early years of erratic behavior, filling the vacuum created by the king's inconsistent governance, and keeping the daily operations of the crown functioning through the sheer force of his own competence. During those years, Tywin had come to believe that he was indispensable, that his service had elevated him to a position akin to a partner in the exercise of power. Aerys, however, held a vastly different view. His decision to induct Jaime into the Kingsguard was the most unambiguous statement of his perception of Tywin's ambitions. It was not done for Jaime's benefit, nor for the benefit of the Kingsguard itself. It was done to inflict a wound on Tywin in the most vulnerable place for a lord of his nature, his legacy, his heir, the continuation of everything he had painstakingly built. By taking Jaime, Aerys had communicated in the language of power rather than words. You serve at my pleasure, and I can take from you whatever I choose. Tywin had resigned from his position as Hand and retreated to Casterly Rock, but he had not forgotten. He was not a man who easily forgot slights, real or perceived. Now the realm was engulfed in war, and both sides sought his allegiance. Aerys dispatched ravens, pleading with Tywin to honor their long-standing association. Robert's representatives extended overtures, promising rewards and influence. Both sides understood that the arrival of the Lannister host on their side of the conflict could decisively alter the balance of power. Tywin received them all, listening intently to their pleas and promises. However, he revealed nothing. He kept his intentions secret, his army at the ready, and his face an impenetrable mask. Lords who attempted to glean his position from his responses encountered only the carefully cultivated surface of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that his countenance revealed nothing he had not chosen to reveal. Tywin's waiting was not born of indifference. It was an exercise in precision. He understood with a cold clarity that distinguished him from most men in positions of power that the value of his intervention depended entirely on its timing. To act prematurely would merely assist one side in winning the war, and his support would be taken for granted rather than appropriately rewarded. The Lannisters would fight and bleed, and the victor would thank them politely before promptly forgetting their sacrifices. However, to wait for the right moment, to have his army march through the gates of a collapsing capital would allow him to dictate the terms of the New World Order. The Battle of the Trident provided him with that opportunity. With Rhaegar dead and the Loyalist cause shattered, the inevitable outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was the manner in which King's Landing would fall and who would be seen as its conqueror. Aerys, perhaps genuinely believing that Tywin would honor their old bonds, perhaps driven by desperation, perhaps gripped by a mind that could no longer accurately assess the intentions of those around him, extended an invitation welcoming the Lannister army into the city. Tywin accepted. He marched his host to the gates of King's Landing, and he was granted entry because the men guarding those gates recognized the Lannister colors, remembered the Lannister history of service to the crown, and trusted in the Lannister promises, which had yet to reveal their true nature. And then the gates were open, and the lion was within the walls, and the calculation was complete. It is worthwhile to pause and consider Robert Baratheon himself, not the king he would later become, but the young man who fought in this war. He was approximately 20 years old when the rebellion erupted. He stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a commanding physical presence that would have been the envy of commanders twice his age. He had been trained at the Eyrie, raised alongside Eddard Stark under the watchful tutelage of Jon Arryn, schooled in the arts of war, governance, and the responsibilities of lordship. He was not uneducated, nor was he simple-minded. However, what truly distinguished him from the cautious, measured men around him, from Ned's quiet deliberation and Jon Arryn's long, patient wisdom, was the burning intensity of his emotions. Robert lived at the surface of himself. His joys were boundless, his rages were volcanic, and his grief, when it struck, possessed the power to reshape a man permanently. He had loved Lyanna Stark with the full force of his considerable capacity for feeling. That love had not yet been formally consummated. Their betrothal was a political arrangement, and their relationship had not yet progressed to marriage. Robert was not by nature a patient man in any aspect of his life. In the months leading up to the fateful tourney at Harrenhal, he had spent his time imagining a future with Lyanna, a future that Rhaegar had snatched away and replaced with something that felt to Robert like a profound theft and utter devastation. Lyanna's disappearance had not merely motivated him to fight, it had fused his personal devastation with his military purpose. He yearned to confront Rhaegar, to find the prince whose actions had set everything in motion, and to measure himself against him directly. Lords who might have calculated more carefully about the risks of rebellion found in Robert's uncomplicated fury a compelling reason to set aside their own reservations. He was a cause in himself, not a cautious lord weighing costs, but a man who had been wronged and who intended to right that wrong, inspiring other men to believe that their own grievances were legitimate enough to warrant action. On the battlefield, he was formidable in a way that even his harshest critics were forced to acknowledge. The warhammer he carried, a weapon perfectly suited to a man of his build and temperament, too heavy for most knights to wield effectively, capable of shattering armor in a way that the edge of a sword could not, became a recognizable symbol of the rebellion before the war was even half over. It was perfectly suited to him. He was not a man who required subtlety in his tools. By accounts that military strategists would later scrutinize, he fought multiple engagements in rapid succession at Summerhall. 3 separate loyalist forces had converged in that area, each capable of inflicting significant damage on rebel supply lines and communications. A more cautious commander might have consolidated his forces, chosen the strongest defensive ground, and waited for the loyalist armies to fully combine before attempting to counter them. Robert, however, chose a more audacious approach. He struck each force separately before they could link up, moving between engagements with a speed that his opponents did not anticipate, leveraging the shock of early victories to press his advantage before word of the defeats could spread. It was not an elegant strategy, nor would it have been recognized by the Academy of Careful Siegecraft as refined generalship. However, it proved remarkably effective because Robert understood a crucial element that the textbooks often overlooked. The spirit of an army matters just as much as its numbers, and striking swiftly and decisively before your enemy can recover from shock is often worth more than any tactical maneuver. His men believed in him implicitly. That is the crucial factor that the histories often gloss over too quickly. The grinding confusion of a civil war where supply wagons break down, messengers get lost, and the reasons for fighting sometimes become obscured in the mud and rain of a long campaign. Soldiers need something tangible to hold on to. Robert gave them himself. He was always present at the front lines. He did not command from a comfortable distance. When the hammer fell, it fell from his hand, and his men saw it, and they followed him without hesitation. Eddard Stark, marching south and west to join him, brought something different to the rebellion. Where Robert was fire, Ned was the unyielding weight behind the flame. The northern forces were smaller than those the southern kingdoms could field. The north's population had always been thinly spread across vast distances, and the armies that could be assembled from it reflected that reality. However, they moved with a singular purpose, exhibiting a grim determination that unnerved their enemies. They did not loot or burn unnecessarily, adhering to a strict code of conduct. They were disciplined enough not to overextend their supply lines or scatter in pursuit of individual glory. Ned, unlike many commanders, waged war with a methodical and humane approach, qualities rarely rewarded in the brutal theater of conflict. Yet these very traits were what held his forces together, providing a crucial cohesion that other armies lacked and often failed to maintain. Beneath Ned's calm and collected exterior, however, lay a profound weight, an invisible burden that he bore with grim determination. His father was dead, brutally executed by the Mad King. His brother Brandon also perished in the king's dungeons. His sister Lyanna, his dearest companion, was missing somewhere in the south, her circumstances shrouded in a cloud of unanswered and unsettling questions that gnawed at his peace of mind. He had unexpectedly become the Lord of Winterfell months ago, a role thrust upon him by the devastating catastrophes that had befallen his family, rather than a natural and welcome inheritance. He shouldered the immense burden of this sudden and difficult transition with a seriousness befitting a young man who had not yet fully processed the whirlwind of his emotions, a storm of grief and responsibility that offered him no respite, no opportunity to pause and find his bearings. The two men who had grown up as brothers within the nurturing walls of the Eyrie, Ned and Robert, now jointly led the rebellion's sprawling military effort. They weren't always stationed in the same location on the war-torn map, and their strategies weren't always as perfectly coordinated as later hindsight might suggest. But they were united in purpose and bound by a deep shared understanding. Their bond of friendship transcended the merely personal. It was the very timber that braced and held the alliance upright. Without it, the fragile political arrangement that held the diverse rebel coalition together would have fractured, leaving few reasons for the alliance to endure. Lords who harbored doubts about Robert's volatile temper found reassurance in Ned's unwavering steadiness and commitment to a just and equitable resolution. Lords who were inspired by Robert's fiery energy but wary of his impulsive judgment knew that Ned's calming presence was always somewhere in the broader strategic picture, acting as a crucial check and balance. Jon Arryn skillfully managed the broader political architecture of the rebellion, navigating the complex web of alliances and allegiances. Hoster Tully effectively secured the Riverlands, preventing the Central Kingdoms from sliding back into the grasp of the crown, and steadily, through months of arduous marching and bitter fighting, through a relentless campaign that tested the men to their physical and emotional limits, and that proved the depth and quality of their commitment, the rebel armies relentlessly pushed toward the decisive moment that would determine the future of the realm. That moment was destined to unfold at the Trident, the site of the river's most accessible fords. But before the climactic clash at the Trident, there was the desperate struggle for control of the Riverlands, its fields and villages serving as unwilling battlegrounds. And before the Trident, there was the long and brutal siege of Storm's End, a place of immense strategic value. The Riverlands, strategically vulnerable due to its geography, had not chosen this war. They rarely did. That was the peculiar and recurring tragedy of the Central Kingdoms. Strung out along the great rivers, exposed on all sides, bordered by nearly every power in the realm, and yet effectively protected by none, the Riverlands served as a constant crossroads of conflict. Whenever armies mobilized in Westeros, they inevitably traversed the Riverlands, trampling its fields and disrupting its fragile economy. When the great houses quarreled, it was the farms and villages along the Trident's fertile banks that bore the brunt of the devastation, paying the heaviest price and enduring the longest suffering. Lord Hoster Tully understood this grim reality better than most. His decision to join the rebellion had not been taken lightly. It was a carefully calculated decision based on the need to remove a despot, but one that was full of consequences. He knew the terrible cost that it would exact on the land and people he governed. That heavy cost quickly materialized. Royalist forces loyal to the crown, desperately striving to hold the strategically vital center of the continent against the surging rebel advance, pressed into the Riverlands from multiple directions. The great river castles, once symbols of regional power and stability, became fiercely contested battlegrounds. their walls stained with blood and their courtyards littered with the debris of war. Supply lines vital to the rebel alliance snaked through territory that royalist forces could effectively threaten, sever, and contest, turning the flow of resources into a dangerous gamble. The Riverlands became, for much of the war's middle phase, the epicenter of the conflict, where the fighting was thickest, the stakes were highest, and the consequences most immediate. Hoster Tully staunchly held River Run, the ancient castle strategically perched at the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone River. It was the natural seat of Riverland's power, well-positioned, well-supplied, and fortified enough to withstand a prolonged siege. It did not fall into enemy hands, but merely holding the castle was a far cry from controlling the region, and the surrounding land bled profusely under the relentless pressure of war. The towns and crossings along the rivers became scenes of brutal fighting, episodes often overlooked by the grand histories, which tended to focus on the more celebrated and decisive battles that shaped the narrative
This is a travesty of justice!
Knights and levies, bowmen and rivermen clashed fiercely over bridges and fords and over the narrow stretches of road that served as lifelines for supply movement, where vital resources could be delivered or intercepted with devastating effect. This was not a war of gallant single combats and famous banners, the kind that would later be romanticized in songs and embellished in tales. It was a war of attrition, a relentless grinding down of resources and morale. Was the unglamorous, grueling work of denying the enemy movement, disrupting their supply lines, and maintaining one's own precarious position in a landscape scarred by conflict. As Ned Stark's forces marched south, they passed through or near contested Riverlands territory, and their strict discipline proved invaluable in maintaining the tenuous peace with the local populace. The northern host did not pillage or plunder, an all too common practice among armies in times of war. Ned had issued clear and unequivocal instructions on this point, and his bannermen, bound by personal loyalty to him and understanding the strategic importance of maintaining good relations with the local population, scrupulously respected his orders. The Northmen understood that making enemies of the very people whose roads they were marching on was a recipe for disaster, inviting constant harassment and cutting off vital supplies. They moved through villages and left them standing, the thatched roofs and timber walls untouched by the flames of war. They bought provisions whenever possible, paying fairly for what they needed rather than seizing them by force, earning goodwill and ensuring a steady flow of supplies. The sharp contrast between their conduct and that of some of the other forces moving through the region was duly noted at the time by those who kept records, solidifying Ned's reputation for honor and fairness. The Loyalist commanders in the Riverlands were not without their strengths. The Crown had dispatched capable men to the field, individuals who possessed a deep understanding of the terrain and skillfully used it to make the rebel advance far more costly than it might otherwise have been. Every ford that had to be forced, every ambush that thinned a column of soldiers, every supply wagon that was intercepted, added to the cumulative toll that the war was exacting on the rebel alliance's already strained resources and dwindling patience. But the Riverlands, despite the valiant efforts of its defenders, could not indefinitely withstand the overwhelming weight of the forces moving through them. The rebel forces were simply too numerous, too well-motivated, and too competently led for the Loyalist presence in the region to do more than significantly slow their relentless advance. Slow it they did, buying precious time for the Crown. The men who fought there on both sides, mired in the mud and drenched by the constant rain along the river roads, paid the full and terrible price for a conflict whose origins lay elsewhere, in the intrigues and ambitions of the great houses, and whose ultimate resolution would occur somewhere else entirely, on a more decisive battlefield. While the Riverlands burned, its fields trampled, and its villages ravaged, and while the main rebel host relentlessly pushed south toward the fateful encounter at the Trident, a different kind of war was being waged on the southern coast, a war of attrition and endurance. Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon, a castle of legendary construction and formidable strength, stood as a bastion of rebel resistance against the encroaching forces of the Crown. Its imposing drum tower, according to legend,
won't get away with this!
Daron Godsgrief himself,
the people rise against!
No storm wind could find a corner to grip, ensuring its timeless resilience. It had stood for thousands of years, weathering storms that had leveled lesser fortresses to rubble. It had never fallen to siege, and it would not fall in this war either. Robert Baratheon, the charismatic leader of the rebellion, was not present to personally oversee the defense of his ancestral home. He was in the field, leading his forces north and west, fighting the decisive battles that would determine the rebellion's military progress. The crucial task of holding Storm's End, the symbolic heart of Baratheon power, was entrusted to his younger brother Stannis. Stannis was not yet 20 years old, a young man of unyielding determination. He had not yet distinguished himself in any prior conflict, as no prior conflict had afforded him the opportunity to prove his mettle. He was not celebrated for his charm or charisma, nor was he beloved by the common folk. He was, according to the accounts of those who knew him in those years, a stern and unyielding young man of few words and rigid principle, entirely disinclined toward the theatrical displays of courage and bravado that often made men famous. Yet he was precisely the kind of man who could hold a castle that everyone expected to fall, a man of unwavering resolve and uncompromising duty. The Tyrell host, a formidable force from the Reach, arrived outside the imposing walls of Storm's End with numbers that should have made the outcome of the siege appear inevitable. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden and commander of the Reach's armies, led a vast and well-provisioned force, the largest single loyalist host in the south. They established their camps, strategically positioned their siege engines, and settled in to wait, confident that time and hunger would inevitably break the rebel garrison. Stone walls could hold against the sea and the elements, but they could not be eaten when the grain ran out, turning the castle into a prison. Stannis, ever meticulous and pragmatic, immediately counted his provisions and assessed his men, and promptly initiated a system of strict rationing. What followed was nearly a year of genuine privation and hardship inside those ancient walls, a trial that tested the very limits of human endurance. The garrison and the castle's inhabitants lived on less than they needed, then on progressively less than that, their hunger gnawing at their bellies and testing their resolve. The accounts that survived from that grim period describe conditions that steadily deteriorated, moving from mere discomfort to severe hardship, and finally reaching a point that pushed the inhabitants to the very edge of survival. This was not simply a matter of discomfort for the soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the castle, but also for the servants, cooks, and other non-combatants within the walls who had never asked to be participants in a brutal siege. Yet Stannis did not break. That is not to say that the garrison did not suffer, for they suffered considerably under the relentless siege, but Stannis held the discipline of the castle together, enforcing his will and inspiring unwavering loyalty through the sheer force of his own uncompromising refusal to consider any alternative to victory. He would not negotiate surrender, even as supplies dwindled and hunger gnawed at his men. He would not send messages to Mace Tyrell indicating any softening of resolve, any hint of desperation. He maintained an exterior of unwavering certainty and unbreakable resolve, regardless of the grim reality within the castle walls. He understood, with the practical intelligence of a young man who had studied the art of siege warfare, that the moment the besieging force believed that their target was close to breaking, their resolve would stiffen and their attacks would intensify, while the defenders' morale would be fatally undermined. The garrison was kept alive in the final desperate months of the siege by a daring smuggler named Davos Seaworth, a man of common birth and no noble house to claim. He navigated a small, swift boat through the Tyrell blockade under the cover of darkness. His hold, laden with onions and saltfish, was enough, barely enough, to keep the garrison from starvation. Not enough for comfort or sustenance, but enough for survival. When the war finally ended and Storm's End was relieved, Stannis rewarded Davos for his extraordinary bravery and invaluable service with a knighthood, raising him from obscurity to a position of honor. But Stannis, ever the pragmatist and unflinching enforcer of justice, also famously had the smuggler's fingers shortened, one from each hand down to the knuckle, as punishment for the crimes Davos had committed before entering his service, when he had made his living by illicit means. Stannis firmly believed that both the reward and the punishment were equally required, a testament to his rigid adherence to his personal code of honor. He was that kind of man. The siege never broke Storm's End from the outside. What ultimately ended the siege was the arrival of Eddard Stark with the rebel host after the decisive battle at the Trident, after King's Landing had fallen to the Lannister armies and the war was already irrevocably decided. The Tyrell army, their cause lost, stood down and lifted the siege, opening the gates of Storm's End. Stannis walked out of the castle he had so stubbornly held for the better part of a year into a world that had already moved on without him. He received little recognition for his extraordinary feat of endurance. Stannis was given Dragonstone, a strategically important but somewhat desolate island rather than being restored to Storm's End, his rightful inheritance. Renly, his younger brother who had contributed nothing of significance to the war effort, eventually received the seat that Stannis had bled and suffered to hold, a deep and lasting injustice. The gratitude Stannis believed he had so richly earned never materialized in the form he expected, and that absence, that perceived slight, would profoundly shape everything he did in the years that followed, fueling his ambition, sharpening his sense of grievance, and driving him to pursue his perceived destiny with relentless determination. The Ruby Ford on the Trident River, a crossing wide enough to ford and strategically important enough to hold, became in the year 283 AC the battlefield where the fate of the Targaryen dynasty was irrevocably determined. The royal forces, desperate to stem the tide of rebellion, were commanded by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen himself. It is worth pausing to consider that Rhaegar had not been the central military figure of the war's early phase. His father's council had dispatched other commanders, some of whom had performed adequately, while others had failed spectacularly to contest the relentless rebel advance. The loyalist cause had not been entirely without its victories, but neither had it achieved the decisive blow that could shift the war's momentum and reverse the fortunes of the crown. Rhaegar had been conspicuously absent from that early fighting, and the nature of his absence had generated its own swirling cloud of speculation and rumor among the rebel lords. The question of his whereabouts had its answer in the whispers of Lyanna Stark in a tower in Dorne, a place sheltered from the brutal consequences of the war that his actions had ignited. The precise nature of his sojourn there, whether it was the seclusion of a man consumed by prophecy or the retreat of a man who understood that he had committed an irreparable act and was not yet ready to face the devastating repercussions, is one of those lingering questions that the available evidence does not fully and definitively answer. According to all surviving accounts, when Rhaegar finally emerged from his self-imposed exile and rode north to take command of the royal forces, something about him had fundamentally changed, or perhaps merely resolved itself into a new and hardened form. Those who saw him in those final days before the battle described a man of peculiar stillness and quiet intensity, not the stillness of defeat or despair, but something closer to a somber acceptance. He possessed the quality of a person who had made a profound decision that whatever was coming, he would meet it head-on, with unwavering courage and a fatalistic resolve. He had cause for profound calculation and ample reason for soul-crushing dread, and he may have carried both in equal measure, carefully balancing the hopes and fears that weighed upon his heart. The rebel army that faced him across the Trident was significantly stronger than the disparate forces that had first taken to the field in the war's early months. The recruitment of new men, the arrival of fresh reinforcements from the Vale, and the contributions of northern lords who had traversed the longer, more arduous road south had swelled the rebel ranks and bolstered their fighting capacity. More importantly, the rebel forces were fueled by the unwavering morale of an army that had been consistently winning, achieving victory after victory against the odds, not without suffering losses and not without weathering difficult and perilous moments, but winning broadly, relentlessly moving forward, seizing ground and holding it with unwavering determination. Rhaegar, despite the size of his army, faced fewer advantages than the numbers might have suggested. His men were fighting for a king who inspired no personal loyalty, a king whose madness had alienated many of his subjects. They were fighting for a prince who had initiated a war by making a choice that even his own supporters found difficult to defend, a choice that had shattered the stability of the realm. And they were fighting against men who had genuine grievances and burning anger, a potent and motivating force that is always harder to stand against than the indifferent courage of soldiers merely following orders. The battle itself was fierce and chaotic, as battles involving large forces on open ground tend to be. It was costly in terms of lives lost and ultimately resolved less by any single brilliant stroke of military genius than by the accumulated weight of 1,000 individual encounters, small acts of bravery and desperation that slowly shifted the balance of power. Men fell on both sides, their blood staining the waters of the Trident. Standards went down, only to be raised again by other hands, as determined soldiers rallied to the call of their leaders. The deafening noise, the swirling dust, and the crimson blood of it filled the ford and soaked the banks on either side, transforming the once pristine river into a scene of carnage and despair. And in the midst of all the chaos and carnage, the two men who embodied the war's central conflict, the two figures whose destinies were intertwined, finally came together. Robert, fueled by righteous anger and a burning desire for justice, saw Rhaegar across the battlefield and rode to meet him, seeking a final and decisive confrontation. The single combat between Robert Baratheon and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen has passed into the realm of legend, becoming the kind of story that accumulates detail over generations, each retelling adding something new, smoothing over something else, until the event is transformed into a legend that no longer quite fits the original facts. Men who are not even present at the Trident now claim to vividly remember it, while men who are actually there recall different versions of the same event, colored by their own experiences and biases. The stories have been told so many times in so many halls, by so many voices, that the surface of the event has been polished smooth, losing its original texture and shape. They met in the shallows of the river, the water swirling around their horses' hooves. The warhammer and the sword clashed against each other in a furious exchange, their movements dictated by the swift current, the treacherous footing, and the surrounding chaos of the battlefield. Robert, who had been fighting his way toward this moment for the duration of an entire war, who had carried the specific and consuming anger of a man who believed he had been personally wronged by the man standing before him, brought to the fight something far beyond ordinary battlefield determination. He brought the full force of his righteous fury, his unwavering belief in the justice of his cause, and his burning desire to avenge the wrongs that had been committed against him and his loved ones. Rhaegar fell, his body sinking into the shallow waters of the Trident. Rubies from his armor scattered into the current as he tumbled from his saddle, catching the light for a fleeting moment before the water claimed them, dispersing them downstream like tears shed for a fallen dynasty. Fords would later be remembered as the Ruby Ford, a poignant and enduring memorial to that fateful day. Whether any rubies were actually recovered in the aftermath, or whether the name is simply a symbolic tribute attached to the death of a famous man, matters less than what the image itself captures. The crown prince of the Targaryen dynasty, sinking into the shallows of the river with his jewels floating away around him, is a true and resonant image of what that moment truly meant, even if the precise physical details resist definitive verification. Robert was badly wounded during the fierce combat, sustaining blows deep and serious enough to take him off the field and keep him from participating in the final decisive events of the war. He had, however, accomplished the essential thing that the rebellion required of him. He had killed the man the rebellion desperately needed him to kill, the heir to the throne, the prince who had sparked the conflict. But he would not be there for the end of it, his wounds denying him the satisfaction of witnessing the final triumph of his cause. The royal army, once Rhaegar fell, did not immediately collapse. Armies, especially in the heat of battle, do not always immediately grasp the full implications of their commander's death. The fighting continued, with men on both sides continuing to swing their swords, push forward, and desperately try to hold their ground, because the alternative was to turn their backs in the middle of a raging battle, which is how most men die who do not die facing forward. But the will to continue the fight had been extinguished from the Loyalist center, draining away like blood from a fatal wound. The commanders who had to make critical decisions in the hours following Rhaegar's death were making them without the one thing that had given the royal cause whatever fleeting coherence it still possessed: the charismatic leadership and unifying vision of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The rebel forces, for their part, were electrified and energized by what they had witnessed, or by what word of it had spread to say they had seen. The balance of the battle irrevocably tipped in their favor. The Loyalist forces, their morale shattered, began to withdraw, then retreated in disarray, and finally dissolved into a rout. The war was not yet over, but the question of how it would ultimately end no longer required any serious deliberation or debate. The Targaryen dynasty had but one final horrifying act remaining, and it would be performed not on any battlefield, but in the throne room of King's Landing, by a king who had decided that if the world would not willingly submit to him, he would take it down with him in a fiery conflagration. What Aerys did in the days immediately following the Battle of the Trident tells the complete and chilling story of what he had become, the depths of his madness and the extent of his depravity. He was not without information, for ravens flew swiftly between the capital and the battlefields, carrying news of both victory and defeat. Scouts returned with detailed reports of the rebel advance. Men who had survived the carnage of the Trident made their way back to King's Landing, bearing the devastating news of Rhaegar's death. Aerys knew what had happened. He understood the overall shape of events, even if the full picture took time to fully assemble, and he still had choices available to him. This is perhaps the thing most worth emphasizing about the tragic final days of Aerys Targaryen. A king in his position, despite the dire circumstances, was not entirely without choices. Rational response to the catastrophic news, even a self-interested rational response stripped of all altruism and concerned solely with the survival of the Targaryen line, would have recognized that Rhaegar was gone, but that the line itself was not entirely ended. There were still heirs to consider, potential successors who could carry on the Targaryen legacy. The queen, Rhaella, was pregnant with another child, offering a flicker of hope for the future. Young Viserys, though still a child, existed as another potential heir to the Iron Throne. The dynasty, the rebel Jon Arryn, the term, but Aerys did not negotiate. He had spent years slowly descending into madness, believing that the only answer to any perceived threat was fire, the ultimate weapon of destruction. He had spent years secretly filling the hidden places of King's Landing with the means of final destruction, with caches of wildfire that could obliterate the entire city in a green inferno. He had told himself, and perhaps truly believed, that this was true power, that having the capacity to burn everything was the same as having the capacity to survive anything, a twisted and dangerous delusion. The wildfire was his dragon, a terrifying extension of his own fiery nature. The wildfire was his birthright made manifest in green flame, a symbol of the Targaryen power he believed was his to wield without restraint. And now, with the armies of the rebels marching relentlessly toward his gates and his beloved son dead in a river stained with blood, he reached for it, embracing the madness that had long festered within him. He ordered the pyromancers, those twisted artisans of destruction, to make ready their terrible creations. The pots of wildfire were carefully distributed throughout the city, placed in strategic locations to maximize their destructive potential. The locations, painstakingly prepared over years of patient and obsessive labor, were confirmed. The caches beneath the Sept of Baelor, beneath the crowded storehouses, beneath the very streets through which the common folk of King's Landing walked every day, blissfully unaware of the horrifying doom that burned silently under their feet. All of it was primed, ready to be unleashed at his command. He reportedly paced the throne room in those final frantic days, his fingernails stained black from his constant fidgeting, his eyes burning with feverish intensity. He spoke to the pyromancers in long, rambling sessions, obsessively reviewing their preparations, testing their knowledge, and finding a perverse satisfaction in their reports of readiness. There are accounts pieced together afterward from the fragmented testimony of terrified servants who survived the carnage and the hushed whispers of conflicted guards who spoke under the veil of secrecy that describe a man who had found, in the imminent approach of his own end, a kind of terrifying serenity, a perverse sense of peace born from the depths of his madness. He would burn, he declared with manic glee. The city would burn, consumed by the green flames of wildfire. And from that burning, from that cataclysmic destruction, he would be reborn, rising from the ashes like a phoenix, a true dragon king. This is the language he used. According to the accounts that exist, the twisted and grandiose pronouncements of a mind irrevocably broken. Reborn, he repeated, lost in his delusion. Dragons are born from fire, he reasoned, his voice echoing in the vast and empty throne room. He had the blood of the dragon in him. He had always believed this, had always felt it as a primal identity beneath all the other identities, the trappings of kingship, the bonds of son and husband and lord. And if the fire came now and consumed everything, then perhaps what would rise from it would be something the world had not seen since the last of the great beasts soared above the Blackwater Bay, something terrifying and unstoppable. It was, of course, utter madness, the product of a mind irrevocably shattered by years of paranoia and cruelty. But it was madness with a shape, an internal logic, a perverse and terrifying consistency that made it even more dangerous than simple chaos. He then sent the desperate invitation to Tywin Lannister, the powerful and cunning lord of Casterly Rock. Whether he genuinely believed that Tywin would come to his rescue and defend him after the years of accumulated insult and resentment, after the humiliating resignation from his position as Hand, After everything that had transpired between them, is one of the questions that the historical records simply cannot answer definitively. Perhaps the insidious paranoia that had consumed Aerys had by then completely severed his connection to any accurate reading of the external world, distorting his perceptions and blinding him to the true motivations of those around him. Perhaps he genuinely expected Tywin to come, interpreting the approaching Lannister forces as a sign of impending rescue, and died with that delusional expectation intact. Perhaps he saw through Tywin's elaborate charade, recognizing the treachery that lurked beneath the surface, and invited Tywin to King's Landing anyway, thinking that whatever Tywin ultimately did would simply confirm the deep-seated treachery he had always suspected, and would thereby justify the wholesale burning he was already meticulously planning. Whatever his true motivations, the invitation was sent and Tywin came marching his armies toward the capital. But he did not come to save the king, nor to defend the Targaryen dynasty. When the gates of King's Landing swung open to admit the Lannister armies, the city initially rejoiced, believing in those first confused and chaotic hours that rescue had finally arrived. They had been delivered from the threat of the approaching rebel army. They had not. Tywin's calculation was as cold and precise as everything he did, driven solely by ambition and a ruthless pursuit of power. He had watched the unfolding war from his carefully maintained position of neutrality, patiently observing the ebb and flow of the conflict, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He had seen the devastating outcome of the battle at the Trident. He had received the desperate raven from Aerys, pleading for his aid, and he had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent decades thinking about power and how to acquire and wield it, that the moment to make his move had finally arrived. Not to save the Targaryens from certain defeat, but to ruthlessly replace them, seizing the Iron Throne for himself and his family. The armies he marched into King's Landing wore the crimson and gold colors of House Lannister, not the black and red of House Targaryen. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and possessed a chilling sense of purpose. They moved through the city streets with a controlled efficiency of forces that had been explicitly told what to do and given no room for ambiguity or hesitation. The sacking that followed was carefully controlled, but not gentle. The city suffered immensely, but not in the way it would have suffered under the all-consuming flames of wildfire. That fate, at least, was averted thanks to Tywin's calculated decision, but the capital paid a terrible price for its conquest, and the common people of King's Landing would not soon forget the horrors they had witnessed and endured. In the throne room, Aerys paced frantically, his madness reaching its fever pitch. He had received word that the Lannisters had breached the city walls and were now advancing toward the Red Keep. His pyromancers stood ready, their hands trembling slightly as they awaited his command. The pots of wildfire were strategically placed throughout the city, ready to ignite the entire metropolis in a green inferno. The order needed only to be given, the words uttered, and the destruction would begin. He turned to Jaime Lannister, his Kingsguard, the son of the man who had just betrayed him in the most egregious manner imaginable. He either gave the order to burn the city, unleashing the devastating wildfire, or was on the very precipice of giving it. His hand raised, his lips parted to speak the fatal command, and what happened next in those fleeting moments of history irrevocably determined whether King's Landing would exist as a city in the aftermath, or whether it would be reduced to a smoldering ruin, a testament to the madness and cruelty of a king who had lost all touch with reality. Jaime Lannister, faced with an impossible choice, made a decision that would forever define him, a decision that would both save the city and damn him in the eyes of many. Jaime Lannister killed Aerys, ending the Targaryen dynasty's long and bloody reign. He plunged his sword into the king's back, a brutal act of regicide. Then, to ensure the Mad King Aerys's demise, he slit his throat. Sir Jaime Lannister, the golden-haired prodigy of Casterly Rock who had ascended to the Kingsguard at a tender age, taking his vows before his beard had even fully sprouted, had betrayed his sacred oath. He, the protector, had become the executioner. Afterward, with a chilling calm, he seated himself upon the Iron Throne, the very symbol of the power he had just shattered. When Eddard Stark finally arrived, having ridden relentlessly from the south, pushing his men and horses beyond their limits, what he found was a scene of stark horror. Jaime Lannister was perched upon the Iron Throne, the corpse of the slain king sprawled at his feet and his golden armor stained with blood. The image was a tableau of broken vows and shattered ideals, a king's guard sworn to protect, now an usurper upon the throne presiding over the king he had murdered. Ned Stark was utterly repulsed. The weight of the broken oath pressed down on him, immediate and unacceptable. In Ned's unwavering moral code, a man who pledged his life to safeguard a king and then extinguished it was not worthy of honor or excuse. Me's defense that Aerys had been on the verge of unleashing wildfire and immolating the entire city, while factual, the wildfire was real, the order given or nearly so, did little to mitigate the gravity of his oath-breaking in Ned's eyes. This was the genesis of the rift between two men who had fought on the same side, bled for the same cause. Jaime had acted pragmatically, decisively. He had saved King's Landing, ended the reign of a madman, and averted a catastrophe that would have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet he had done so by shattering his vows, a transgression compounded by the convenient timing of his father's arrival, an event that painted the Lannisters in a light of opportunism. The city was saved, the Targaryens were finished, but the question of Jaime's actions, of whether they were born of necessity or betrayal, heroism or treachery, would haunt him for the rest of his days. He became known as the Kingslayer, a title he could never entirely refute. Before Eddard Stark's arrival, before the Stark reckoning in the throne room while Lannister forces were still securing the city, a far more heinous act unfolded. Within the Red Keep, in the chambers where Princess Alia Martell had sought refuge with her children, Rhaenys, a girl barely 3 years old, and Aegon, an infant, Lannister men forced their way through the door. What ensued is one of the darkest, most morally reprehensible episodes of the rebellion's conclusion. The precise chain of command, the explicit orders issued or withheld, remain shrouded in historical ambiguity. What is undeniably clear is the outcome. The children of Rhaegar and Alia were brutally murdered. Alia herself was slain, the man most directly implicated both by reputation, proximity, and subsequent investigation by conscientious lords was Gregor Clegane, a knight in Lannister service, a towering figure of monstrous size and equally monstrous cruelty, whose name was synonymous with brutality throughout the Westerlands. The children were butchered, Princess Alia was murdered, and Sir Gregor Clegane walked out of those blood-soaked chambers a free man, still in the service of a lord who had just gained immeasurable political advantage from a war they had strategically delayed entering until the outcome was assured. Tywin Lannister brazenly presented the bodies, meticulously wrapped as if in reverence to Robert Baratheon upon the new king's arrival, as proof of loyalty, as a definitive statement that the Targaryen line was extinguished. Robert reportedly deemed it a good thing. Ned Stark did not. This marked another fissure, a deeper one than the first. Ned had fought the war believing in its noble cause. The removal of a mad king, the restoration of justice, the avenging of his family's murdered kin. But the slaughter of innocent children was not justice, was not the cause for which he had raised his banners. The Lannisters' method of securing Robert's victory to Ned was a stain upon everything the rebellion professed to represent. He voiced his disapproval. Robert, in his moment of triumph, refused to hear it. The initial crack between the two old friends, laid in the rubble of King's Landing before the victory was even formally celebrated, was small yet small fractures, whether in stone or in friendship, have a tendency to spread. While King's Landing was being secured, while Robert embarked on the business of seizing a throne and selecting a queen, Eddard Stark was riding south, driven by a more urgent purpose. He had not prioritized the capital because Lyanna, his sister, wherever she might be, was his overriding concern. He had fought the entire war with this objective buried beneath the weight of command, alliance, and strategy. Every battle, every march, every decision made at the head of a northern host was tinged with the thought of Lyanna, of her captivity, of her fate. With the fighting concluded, nothing stood between him and his sister. He rode towards dawn, towards a place that would later be known as the Tower of Joy. He traveled with a small company of loyal men, 7 riders in all, according to surviving accounts, men who had stood by him throughout the rebellion, men he trusted enough to bring on an errand whose true nature he could not fully divulge, because he himself was unsure of what he would find. What he found was the King's Guard, 3 of them in their pristine white cloaks, armed and resolute, standing before the tower's entrance. Sir Arthur Dane of Starfall, the Sword of the Morning, arguably the most celebrated swordsman the realm had ever produced within living memory, a man whose reputation was so legendary that even other great knights spoke of him with a reverence reserved for those who transcended ordinary measurement. Sir Oswell Went was also present, alongside Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, the most senior of the three, white-haired and as immovable as the stones of the tower itself. 3 Kingsguard, 3 of the most formidable warriors in the realm, standing guard before a tower at dawn, while their king had perished in King's Landing without their protection. The question of why they were there, why these particular knights, sworn to safeguard the king's life, had spent the war at a remote Dornish tower rather than at the king's side, is one of the enduring mysteries of the rebellion, a question that the available evidence dances around without fully answering. Rhaegar had sent them, or Aerys had placed them there, or they had chosen it themselves. The accounts diverge. What they all agree on is that when Ned arrived, the 3 knights made no move to yield. They offered no explanation. Their stance and their silence conveyed a clear message. Whatever lay inside the tower was under their protection and would remain so. Ned informed them that the war was over. He told them that Rhaegar was dead. Whatever internal calculations they made, it did not sway them. Perhaps they had sworn an oath that superseded the outcome of the war. Perhaps they understood that they had already committed themselves, in the deepest sense, to this post and this moment. Perhaps their inherent character simply precluded the kind of pragmatism that would have allowed them to step aside. The ensuing battle claimed the lives of most of the men Ned had brought with him. 6 of his 7 companions perished before that tower. The 3 Kingsguard also fell, a testament to something profound, though it is difficult to pinpoint precisely what. To the quality of the men involved, certainly. To the gravity with which both sides regarded the situation. Only Ned and Howland Reed survived. Ned ascended the stairs. He found Lyanna dying. She had given birth, and the process had taken its toll. She was fading but conscious. She recognized him. They had a brief respite. What she whispered to him, what she made him promise in those final moments, history does not record with the same precision as battles and treaties. The words passed between a dying girl and her surviving brother in a room at dawn. Then she was gone. And Ned descended the stairs carrying an infant and a secret. The infant was a boy. Ned named him Jon Snow of Winterfell, presented to the world as a bastard son, the result of some wartime liaison whose mother Ned refused to name. The story did not align with the man. Everyone who knew Ned Stark, even casually, found it difficult to reconcile with their understanding of his character. Catelyn, who had to endure the mystery within her own household, found it the most challenging of all. The silence Ned maintained on the subject was absolute and permanent, a silence that must have extracted a daily toll. He carried Lyanna home to Winterfell. He laid her to rest in the crypts, alongside the kings and lords of the north who had come before her. In the stories that circulated afterward, people would claim he brought something small of hers down into that darkness, some memento of the beginning, some reminder that the road to the Tower of Joy had commenced at Harrenhal, with a crown of winter roses and a silence that lingered too long. Whether that was memory or the embellishment of grief, only Ned ever knew, and Ned never elucidated any of it. He ascended the stairs. He had a kingdom to serve, a family to raise, and a lord's duties to fulfill. The grief accompanied him everywhere, and most who observed him in those years could perceive it without being able to articulate it. He was a man who had endured something unspeakable, and who had chosen to prioritize everything else above speaking of it. Whether that was strength or loss, or a combination of both that defies easy categorization, is a question each person must answer for themselves. 3 knights stood before a tower at dawn while their king burned in King's Landing. This is the stark, inescapable fact that lies at the heart of the Tower of Joy, stranger in some ways than anything else that transpired there. Sir Arthur Dane, Sir Oswell Went, Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, 3 of the most accomplished swordsmen in the realm, wearing the white cloaks of the Kingsguard, an order whose sole sacred charge was the preservation of the king's life. And they were not in King's Landing. They were not at the Trident. They were at a tower in Dorne guarding something other than the king. Their presence there raises questions that cut to the core of what oath-keeping truly means when oaths collide. Kingsguard knights were bound by vows of absolute fidelity. They swore to protect the king above all else, above family, above personal feelings, above any other obligation. They donned the white cloak and relinquished the rest of their lives. No wife, no children, no lands or inheritance. The cloak was everything, and the king's life was the cloak's raison d'etre. It was one of the oldest and most solemn pledges in the realm's tradition. Sir Arthur Dayne had not abandoned that pledge out of cowardice or self-interest. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests the contrary. Those who faced him in the training yard or on the battlefield spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for those who transcend ordinary measurement. He was known as the Sword of the Morning, a title held by the Knight of House Dane who wielded their ancestral blade, Dawn, a sword said to be forged from the heart of a fallen star. Men who could defeat any other knight in the realm confessed that they did not know if they could defeat Arthur Dayne, and he died at the Tower of Joy. He and his two companions fell to Eddard Stark and the survivors of the small company Ned brought with him, and the accounts suggest that it cost Ned dearly, even with numerical superiority, so why were they there? The answer almost certainly lies with Rhaegar. The prince had stationed them at the tower, not the king. Aerys had no part in this arrangement, or if he did, no record of his involvement survives. Rhaegar had issued instructions to his Kingsguard, and those instructions had directed them south to Dorne while the war raged without them. This is where, if those they were he died at the tower, standing his ground, without summoning assistance or abandoning his post when the war's outcome became apparent. This is, or it is, they were, whether what Robert, he was a more practical, he was the elder lord who had raised both Robert and Ned, who had been the first to raise his banners, who had sustained the rebellion in its early stages through the sheer force of his reputation and his steadfast judgment, assumed his position beside the new king. He would serve faithfully for years. He would eventually uncover the truth about Cersei's children, that they were not Robert's but her own twin brothers, and he would be murdered for that discovery before he could act upon it. Ned Stark went home. He returned to Winterfell. He had no inclination for the games of the capital, no desire to abandon the north that needed him. He married Catelyn Tully, his brother's intended, now his own, a marriage forged in the crucible of war, and rebuilt what his father's death and the rebellion had diminished. He did so quietly and effectively. He was a good lord. His people were safe. His family flourished. He took his responsibilities to the Night's Watch seriously at a time when few others did. He raised the bastard Jon alongside his own sons and daughters and guarded the secret of the boy's parentage with the particular ferocity of a man who understood the potential cost of the truth. Stannis Baratheon defended Storm's End throughout the protracted siege with a tenacity that became the opening chapter of his legend. He received no lavish reward for his efforts. When King's Landing fell and the war concluded, Robert granted Dragonstone, the former Targaryen seat, the island fortress in the bay, to Stannis, rather than restoring Storm's End to him outright. The logistics of the decision made a certain sense. Stannis was already familiar to the Dragonstone garrison, but the symbolism stung. Storm's End was their ancestral home. Stannis had held it for a year under siege while others fought the war's more celebrated battles, and his reward was a windswept island that reeked of salt and old dragon bones, while Renly, their younger brother who had been too young to participate in the fighting, eventually received Storm's End itself. Stannis Baratheon did not forget. He was not a man who readily forgot slights. The resentment festered slowly, as the most enduring resentments often do, not with loud pronouncements or public grievances, but in the quiet accumulation of a long accounting that he carried alongside everything else. Robert seized his throne and began the slow, agonizing process of realizing that ruling a kingdom bore little resemblance to conquering one. He possessed the Iron Throne. He had allies. He had a queen, Cersei Lannister, who brought Westerland's gold and Lannister might, but nothing resembling affection or genuine loyalty to the marriage. The small council teemed with men who knew how to navigate the corridors of power. Jon Arryn managed the day-to-day administration with a reliable competence that had made him invaluable throughout his career. The realm began to function again, but Robert himself began to decay from within. The man who had blazed across the rebellion like a wildfire found himself, in the ensuing peace, a man without sufficient fuel. He was not suited for the deliberate daily grind of governance. He was built for crisis, for the clarity of purpose that accompanied having an enemy, a direction, and a cause. Peace offered none of those things. and in their absence he sought refuge in the familiar consolations, the feast, the hunt, the brothel, with escalating desperation and dwindling capacity for shame. Lyanna haunted him. Her tomb in the crypts of Winterfell drew him back whenever he visited. He would stand in the cold, dark depths of that ancient place, grieving in a way that he could not allow himself to do in any other setting. The living woman beside him in his bed was invariably, in some part of his mind, a comparison drawn against the deceased girl he had loved and lost. Cersei understood this as with the particular cold and precise clarity that characterized her understanding of most things. It did not endear him to her. It made her more ruthlessly self-serving, which from her perspective may have amounted to the same thing, and in the sun-drenched lands of Essos, far from the ruins of King's Landing, a woman named Rhaella Targaryen died in childbirth on Dragonstone. She had been sent there before the city fell, carrying the last embers of the dynasty within her womb. The child she bore was a daughter. The daughter would be named Daenerys. Then a storm swept through, scattering the Targaryen fleet. A young man, Viserys, Aerys' surviving son, seized his infant sister and fled across the narrow sea. They crossed with nothing but their name, and whatever retainers could not bear to abandon the last vestiges of their line. They would wander the free cities for years, diminished, dependent, moving from one borrowed hall to the next. As former allies grew weary of the obligation and the welcome wore thin, Viserys carried the crown in his head, as exiles invariably do, with an intensity that grew more brittle and more desperate the longer the exile lasted. The dragons his house had once ridden were gone. The claim endured, but the claim would not hatch into anything tangible for a very long time. There is a temptation, when reflecting on Robert's rebellion, to perceive it as a straightforward narrative with a clean resolution. The Mad King was overthrown, justice was served, the realm was spared the full extent of Aerys' madness. A new dynasty ascended to the throne, promising stability, but the victory was not clean. It never had been. The deeds committed to achieve it, the murders in the Red Keep's chambers, the looting and fires that marred the sack, the manner of the Mad King's demise, were not abstract concepts. They were concrete actions carried out by specific individuals, and they left behind specific grievances in their wake. The Martells of Dorne remembered. They would remember for a very long time, quietly and precisely, in the manner of a people who understood that time is not always an enemy of justice. They had sent their princess to the Red Keep as a bride, and she had returned in pieces, and the man who sat upon the Iron Throne had accepted that offering without punishment and deemed it a propitious beginning. The wound in Sunspear would not heal while those men still drew breath. Rhaegar's children were dead. The prince who had ignited everything by placing a crown of roses in the wrong woman's lap had fallen at the Trident. His wife had been murdered in her own chambers. His daughter and infant son had been slain before they were old enough to grasp the meaning of a crown or why it could cost a life. The Targaryen line was not entirely extinguished. Viserys and the infant Daenerys had crossed the narrow sea, but the branch of House Targaryen that had blossomed with such arrogant splendor at Harrenhal, only to be brutally severed at the Trident, left behind no living legitimate heirs to claim the Iron Throne. The dragon's fire seemed extinguished, save for embers flickering across the narrow sea. The lords who had flocked to Robert's banner, united by a common enemy and the intoxicating promise of victory, were never a truly unified force. They were a coalition of self-interests, bound together for the duration of the war, now returning to their own carefully laid plans and long-simmering ambitions. The camaraderie forged in the heat of battle, the alliances sworn in blood, these were genuine, yes, but the true test of such bonds lay not in war but in the subtle, often treacherous currents of peacetime. Almost immediately the Game of Thrones resumed, with its intricate web of debts and resentments. Old obligations were scrutinized and recalculated, often with a cynical eye. New grievances, born of perceived slights and unmet expectations, festered beneath the surface. Reach lords, who had spent much of the war languishing under the banners of siege outside Storm's End, their ambition curtailed, now joined the new order with carefully calibrated smiles and the practiced diplomacy of men who had backed the losing side and desperately needed to be seen as something other than defeated. The rebellion had indeed produced a king, a powerful warrior celebrated in song and story, but it had singularly failed to create the stable conditions necessary for good governance. Robert was a magnificent warrior, a man who could inspire armies and cleave skulls with his legendary warhammer. He knew how to fight, how to endure hardship, how to lead men into the very jaws of death. But he possessed little patience for the tedious, unglamorous work of ruling. He did not know how to be still, how to listen, how to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, the endless trade negotiations, the long-running disputes between noble houses that required attentive, sustained attention to resolve fairly. These were tasks that bored and frustrated him. He delegated that crucial work to Jon Arryn, his hand, a man of unwavering loyalty and sharp intellect, and the arrangement worked, more or less, as long as Jon Arryn lived, his wisdom and tireless efforts holding the fragile kingdom together. But the foundation was inherently unstable, its strength dependent entirely on the health and capabilities of one aging man, carrying a burden that should have been distributed far more broadly across the realm. The new kingdom, for all its outward appearance of strength and stability, lacked any real depth of governance. It had a king who was increasingly detached and disinterested, a hand who valiantly compensated for his king's failings, and a council of powerful men, each serving their own interests beneath a thin, easily pierced veneer of collective purpose. Ned Stark, Warden of the North, understood this perhaps better than any man in the Seven Kingdoms. He had witnessed the true cost of victory, the rivers of blood and the mountains of corpses. He had seen the darkness that lurked within even the noblest of causes. He carried the grief and disillusionment of the war back north with him, burdened by the unanswered questions that gnawed at his conscience. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the edifice they had so painstakingly constructed was fragile, teetering on the brink of collapse. He knew that the hands now grasping for power were not always steady nor always clean. He had looked upon the Iron Throne as a young man, fresh from the horrors of war, and seen not the glorious symbol of power and authority that others so eagerly coveted, but a monstrous thing of accumulated blades, a weapon that cut the person sitting upon it as surely as it cut all those who dared to defy them. He was right, more right than he could possibly have articulated at the time, and it was a truth for which he would eventually pay the ultimate price. The foundations of Robert's reign, the hasty arrangements made in the rubble and euphoria of victory, the debts traded for allegiance, the convenient silences maintained to avoid further bloodshed, these would take 15 long years to fully crack, to splinter and crumble under the weight of their own inherent flaws, but crack they would. Everything that came later, the War of the Five Kings, the shattered houses, the scattered children of the great families, all grew from the poisonous seeds planted in the rebellion's bloody aftermath, the insidious Lannister influence that wormed its way into the very heart of the royal household. The simmering Martell grievance, carefully nurtured and waiting for its moment in the shadows of Dorne. The Baratheon brothers, divided by bitter resentment and unchecked ambition, and the bastard in Winterfell, the silent, brooding Jon Snow, whose true parentage, if ever revealed, would shatter the entire question of succession and plunge the realm into yet another bloody conflict. Power changes hands, as it always does, but the damage inflicted in the process of that change, the compromises made, the moral compromises sacrificed, do not simply disappear, they linger, festering like a wound left untended. They work their way into the very fabric of society, into the walls of castles and the hearts of men. It becomes the damp in the stone that no one notices, the subtle rot that slowly weakens the structure until one day the entire edifice begins to crumble. The tournament at Harrenhal, with its pageantry and its petty intrigues, is where most histories choose to begin this tragic tale. But that is a superficial understanding, a focus on the symptom rather than the underlying disease. The tournament is merely the visible manifestation of a deeper malaise, the crown of roses hiding a multitude of thorns, the public slight that masks a web of long-standing grievances. It is the incident that can be neatly pointed to and precisely dated, but it is not the true beginning. The real beginning is far more elusive, harder to pinpoint with any degree of certainty. It lies somewhere in the slow, insidious accumulation of years under a king whose own mind was gradually becoming his worst enemy, consumed by paranoia and prone to fits of uncontrollable rage. It is in the growing distance that opened between Aerys and the lords who had once served him with unwavering loyalty, the steady erosion of trust, not in single dramatic ruptures, but in the relentless wearing down of small disappointments and petty betrayals. What the rebellion ultimately reveals, for those who are willing to sit with it long enough to truly understand its complexities, is how much the stability and order of a realm depends not on its laws or its traditions or its ancient oaths, but on the quality of the people at its very center, the men and women who wield power and influence. The compact between Lord and King is, at its core, an agreement about restraint, a mutual understanding of the limitations of power. The king does not abuse his authority, does not become a tyrant. The lords do not act solely on their private grievances, do not succumb to petty jealousies and personal ambitions. Both sides hold themselves to something larger than their immediate advantage, to the good of the realm as a whole. But when one side stops holding, when that implicit contract is broken, the other will eventually follow, succumbing to the same temptations and abandoning the same principles. Aerys Targaryen stopped holding, not all at once, but gradually, insidiously. With each man he burned alive, with each promise he broke, with each paranoid accusation he elevated to the force of law, he tested the limits of what the realm would endure, pushing the boundaries of obedience to the breaking point, and the realm endured more than it should have. Out of habit, out of tradition, out of a lingering sense of loyalty, and out of the faint but persistent hope that things might somehow improve, that the king might somehow return to his senses. But there is a point beyond which endurance becomes complicity, a point where silence becomes betrayal. And Rickard Stark's agonizing death in that throne room, with his son Brandon slowly strangling beside him, was the point past which no man of honor, no man of conscience could stand still and do nothing. Rhaegar Targaryen's actions, his impulsive abduction of Lyanna Stark, sparked the rebellion, ignited the tinderbox of discontent that had been smoldering for years. But it was Aerys Targaryen's madness, his descent into cruelty and paranoia, that made the rebellion inevitable, that turned simmering resentment into open revolt. Robert Baratheon won the war with a thunderous blow from his warhammer and a grief that would never find its resolution, a wound that would fester until the day he died. Ned Stark endured it, carrying a secret to the grave, a burden of knowledge that shaped his every action and haunted his every dream. Jaime Lannister survived it, branded with a name, Kingslayer, that was simultaneously the worst thing he had ever been called and the most accurate description of his act. And Lyanna Stark died in a tower in Dorne, her brother Ned beside her, whatever truth she knew dissolving into the quiet and the cold stone, leaving behind the long, unanswerable question of what she had chosen and what had been chosen for her. The fire of rebellion that remade the world, that cleansed the land of the Targaryen dynasty, did not burn itself clean. Fires rarely do. They leave behind ash and soot and the charred remains of what once was. They leave behind the things that were buried in the ash, the secrets and lies and unspoken truths that will continue to haunt the land for generations to come. And they leave behind the people who must live on that land, who must rebuild and try to create something new from the ruins. Westeros rebuilt, as Westeros always does. The question that the rebellion leaves behind, the question that continues to echo through the halls of power and the hovels of the poor, is not whether the right men won. It is whether winning is ever truly clean, whether any victory can be achieved without sacrificing something of value, without leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered lives. When the very method of winning has already determined what comes next, when the means justify the ends, then the seeds of future conflict are inevitably sown. The Lannisters entered King's Landing through opened gates, but their ruthlessness and ambition would soon turn those gates into walls, dividing them from the rest of the realm. The Targaryens died not only on the battlefield but in nurseries, their blood spilled by those who claimed to be bringing peace and justice. The new king married a woman whose loyalty was always to her family first, to her husband and her kingdom second. The most honorable man in the rebellion went home to the north, retreating behind the ancient walls of Winterfell, and spent the next 15 years trying to keep the world at arm's length, shielding his family from the corruption and intrigue that he knew lurked in the south. None of it held. Somewhere in the rubble of King's Landing, beneath the ash of Aerys's shattered ambitions, the next war was already being built, stone by stone, lie by lie, quietly, without ceremony, in the darkness where secrets fester and resentments grow. The way all the worst things are built, slowly, deliberately, one stone at a time, And the roses, the beautiful, fragrant roses that had once symbolized love and hope, were still out there somewhere, scattered in a river, left to wither in a dead woman's crypt, a poignant reminder of what had been lost. The realm had moved on, as realms always move on, adapting and evolving to meet the challenges of a new era. But some things that seem to end do not end at all. They simply go quiet, lying dormant beneath the surface. They wait, patient and unforgiving, in the stone and the cold and the long dark, until the season turns again, and what was buried becomes once more impossible to ignore, rising from the ashes to haunt the present and shape the future. And so the rebellion ended, but the story did not. Mad King burned, a prince fell in a river of rubies, a city was saved by a broken oath, and in a quiet tower at dawn, a promise was made that would echo through generations. Robert won his throne, but victory came stained with ash and blood. The dragons were gone, yet their shadow lingered. The war was over, yet its consequences had only begun. Perhaps that is the true lesson of Robert's rebellion. No victory is ever clean, no crown is ever won without cost, and sometimes the seeds of the next war are planted the very moment the last one ends. So now I ask you, what do you think truly ended the Targaryen dynasty? Madness, prophecy, or ambition? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey into Westeros meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to Scottish Sleep Stories for more immersive tales of history, legend, and the quiet moments that shape the world. Till